British prime ministers. Since 1721, I believe, there's been 76 British prime ministers. Out of those 76, how many of them have been women? One. Now two. So the ratio is not good there. 1 to 36, 37, something like that. Sometimes, actually most of the time, men have been overrepresented in the halls of power and women have been underrepresented. And it seems that it's that way with our biblical stories as well. So if you think about the biblical story, we think of Abraham and Jacob and Isaac and Solomon and David and Noah and Jesus and Peter and Paul, Elijah and Elisha, and the list goes on. And they have a lot of power in the story, and there are a small fraction of people who are women who hold power in this story. But the exception is today, where we get to celebrate two of them, talk about two of them, Queen Vashti and Queen Esther. I was looking at the lectionary, and it turns out that unless you've gone out of your way to read the story of Esther, it only appears once in the lectionary. So in the 3 years that we have for lectionary stories, it only appears once, which means we only read a few verses of Esther once every 3 years, and that's all we get from Esther. So today I'm going to take advantage of that, and I'm going to summarize the story. It is a really wonderful story. It'd make a great TV miniseries. I'm pretty sure a few movies have already been made of it. In order to understand the story of Esther, first we need to understand the story of exile. Now, exile, if you've been around Chemainus United Church in the last 2 years, is a common theme. We've spoken about exile in Advent. We've spoken about exile on a number of different occasions, be it in Egypt, in Assyria, or in Babylon. And so the story of Esther takes place after the Jewish population has been deported during the Babylonian exile. So Babylon comes in, takes over Jerusalem, and deports all the Jews to another land. And as is the case with empire, then that empire falls and the Persian Empire takes over. So now the Jewish population is under the Persian rule. And there's a king who now rules a vast swath of land. And I suppose when you get nice and comfortable and you're in power, you can do whatever the heck you want. And so this king is no different. And so he decides to throw the party of all parties. And so he invites people from all over the place to come to this crazy 7-day-long party. And he instructs his stewards, his wine stewards, give them whatever they want. Whatever they want, let them have it. And so you can imagine how this party unfolds. Now, near the end of the party, he, maybe in his drunken stupor, maybe out of his pompous ego, he decides that Queen Vashti should appear before his party. Now, Queen Vashti has been told to run a party of her own for the women in her part of the palace, and the king's part is just for the men. And he decides that Queen Vashti should come forward. Now, in the story, it actually says she should come forward that her beauty might be shown. Now, scholars think that actually what this probably means is that she was to be paraded naked in front of everyone. Queen Vashti says, no, I am not going to do that. Now, she is the queen in a very powerful kingdom with a king who, in the story, is portrayed as not very wise, smart, or intelligent. When we talk about acts of courage, I think her act of defiance, saying, no, I will not be objectified, is a profoundly courageous and beautiful story. Now, we don't know what happens to Vashti. I suppose you can let your imagination run wild. Is she killed? We don't know. Is she sent off to a faraway work camp? We don't know. But what we do know is that the king sets out to replace her. And he does this by sending his eunuchs out to the whole land to find all the beautiful unwed girls that he can. And they all come to this palace, and there they are essentially groomed. I think in one account, somebody suggests that it might be as long as a year where they are beautified. And Esther seems to make a mark. He makes a mark with the eunuchs, and then she makes a mark with the king. And she's considered beautiful, and the king decides that Esther will be his new wife. Now, the interesting thing about this is, or maybe saddest thing about this, is Esther maybe is 14, 16, something like that. And what's also interesting, I'm not sure if you picked up on this while reading it so well, is that Esther has no parents. She's an orphan, raised by her uncle, and she's Jewish. So she is an exiled orphan who is now queen of this new kingdom. Things seem to be going well for Esther in the palace. Esther keeps Mordecai informed, and Mordecai keeps Esther informed. Now, Mordecai is the uncle, and he plays a crucial role in this story as well. One day, Mordecai is outside of the gates of the palace, and he hears two people plotting to kill the king. So he tells Esther. Esther tells the king, and the king takes care of the plot. You can imagine what that looks like. And Mordecai is quickly forgotten. So Esther continues life in the palace. And the king is not particularly intelligent in this story. He's kind of painted as a bumbling fool. The person who really holds power is Haman, his kind of henchman, his right-hand man, the second in command. And Haman walks out in the palace and walks out in the town. And when he walks out in the town, people are supposed to bow down in front of him. And everyone does, except for one person, Mordecai. Mordecai refuses to bow down in front of Haman. Well, this makes Haman furious. So Haman, in his shrewdness, decides to write an edict. And the edict is that all Jews should be killed. In this way, he kind of gets to Mordecai, because Mordecai, of course, is Jewish. Mordecai feeds word of this to Esther, and Esther is quite nervous. What is she to do? Now, there comes a point in the story where Esther's courage is shown to its maximum effect. You see, the only people who could go in front of the king were people who were summoned. If the king summoned you, no problem. But if you were to appear in front of the king without those summons, you could be killed. And so really, it was a risk. If you go in front of the king, it's a 50-50 chance. Is he having a bad day? Is he having a good day? Is he looking forward to seeing you? Does he have no idea who you are? And so Esther has this great choice. So she summons up the courage, risks everything, and stands in front of the king. The king says, Esther, what can I do for you? Everyone kind of breathes a sigh of relief. She's okay. And she says, I want to invite you and Haman over for a meal. And the king is flattered. Great, we would love to come to your meal. And Haman is quite happy as well. And so they come over for a meal. And the king, during this meal, says to Esther, Esther, I can give you anything. I could even give you half of my kingdom if you requested it. What do you want? And Esther says, give me a day to think about it. Come back for a meal tomorrow, and when you come back tomorrow, I will tell you. So they part ways. And it's a very important night. The king goes to his chambers and he tries to fall asleep, but he can't. And so he decides to have the history of the kingdom read to him, which I assume is his way of reading a boring textbook to fall asleep. And the king is listening to this history, and the servant stumbles across this story of Mordecai, who had saved his life a number of years earlier. This sticks with the king. Meanwhile, Haman goes home that day, and once again he sees Mordecai, and he's so angry at Mordecai that he decides to have a 50-foot gallows built on which he will execute Mordecai. The next morning, Haman comes to work, and the king has a question for Haman. Haman, what should you do for someone who saved your life? What should you do for someone who you greatly respect? Now, Haman thinks the king is talking about, well, Haman. And so he says, well, you know, king, I would put them on a horse, I would wrap them in royal gowns, I would put a crown on them, and I would parade them through the town, telling everybody how great this person is. And the king says, well, that sounds like a great way to honor somebody. I want you to go find Mordecai and put him on a horse, put royal crowns on him, and tell everyone how great Mordecai is. Well, you can imagine how Haman feels about this responsibility. I can only imagine he kind of did it half-heartedly. That night, they're at dinner the second time, and it's here where the king asks, Esther, what can I do for you? And Esther says, there's an edict been put out, and my people are going to die. And the king is furious. How could this possibly happen to Esther and Mordecai, two people that he cares about deeply? And Esther looks across the table, and there's Haman. Points at Haman. That's the guy. Well, you can imagine the fallout. The gallows that Mordecai has, the gallows that Haman built for Mordecai are now used on himself. And Esther and Mordecai are brought into the close circle of the king. Now, when I look back at that story, the story of Queen Vashti, who says, no, I will not be objectified, and the story of Esther, who has the courage and the risk to stand in front of the king, I'm amazed. You know, Esther is the only book in the Bible where God is not mentioned once. There is no mention of the Spirit of God in Esther. There is no mention of God's divine plan at work. It just is a story. But we've been talking about the image of God being reflected in women and in men. And so if you ask me where the image of God is in this story, well, it's in these two incredible women who take courageous risks. In 1957, there was another courageous group of women called the Little Rock Nine. They were to be the first African American students enrolled in high school in Arkansas. It was a plan of desegregation that was set forth. The governor, I should say, decided that he was going to do whatever he could to prevent these 9 young women from coming to school. So he brought in, I believe it was the National Guard. And his theory, his kind of public speak for this action was this. He said, we're going to bring them in because there's going to be segregationists on one side, there's going to be desegregationists on the other side. They're bound to clash at some point during this. And so we need an army to stand in the way. But really, it was just to prevent these young women from coming to school. This standoff went on for about 3.5 weeks until Dwight Eisenhower came in, federalized the army that was there, and kicked the governor out, essentially. But the price was paid for those young women. They spoke of incredible abuse in their first year at school. Verbal and physical abuse, being spit on as they walked through the halls, and called all sorts of ugly names. One of them had acid thrown in their eyes. Another remembers getting locked in a washroom stall as young girls threw burning pieces of paper into it in an attempt to burn them. So there's Vashti and there's Esther and there's the Little Rock Nine who are there performing incredible, courageous acts. The treatment of women is something that is still far from settled in our world. Some of you may have seen this. This is a Dove commercial from just a couple of years ago. I think the most striking part of that commercial is not necessarily the makeup or the hair, but the fact that she's taken into Photoshop. Her neck is extended and her eyes made bigger. Yeah. This was a picture from yesterday that made it on the news. A very famous model took a picture of another woman in a locker room with this caption: "If I can't unsee this, then you can't either." It's a woman who is maybe average by all standards. Or there is this woman, again from yesterday. I didn't need to look too far back in the news history to find these stories, by the way, all from yesterday. She was killed by her brother in Iran as an honor killing for speaking out against the patriarchy. And, you know, we sometimes think, well, these things happen in some faraway land, but right here in BC, we have our very own Highway of Tears, where, well, estimates are somewhere between 16 and 40, maybe more women who have disappeared on this highway. So in dealing with this topic, figuring out what we should do next, we are reminded that sometimes our job as a church is to be courageous, to take great risks. Think Little Rock Nine, think Queen Esther, think Queen Vashti. And so often we see it as saying no, right? We're just saying no to something. But maybe in the saying no, we're actually saying yes to something else. We need to say no to Islamophobia. We need to say no to excessive police violence against minorities. And we need to say, in the light of Baton Rouge today, we need to say no against any violence against police. We need to say no to our excessive buying of war machines, and we need to say no to pipelines. But in saying no to those things, what are we saying yes to? We're saying yes to meeting the divine in our neighbor. We're saying yes to a more peaceable world. And we're saying yes to an environment that is spectacular and profound and more intricate than we can possibly imagine or than our little brains can comprehend. Like I said a couple of weeks ago, if somebody sells you an easy version of Christianity, then they're selling you the wrong version. Because sometimes It requires that we have the courage and the strength and the boldness, and that we take risks like Vashti and Esther. May these stories work on your mind this week.